The name Donnie Brasco is infamous, to say the least, but most of us know it for the 1997 movie starring Al Pacino and heartthrob Johnny Depp. But actually, Brasco was a real name, responsible for putting more than 100 mobsters behind bars, for 200 indictments, and for being the head of one of the FBI's most elaborate operations to infiltrate the mob in the history of sting operations. Donnie Brasco, or should we say Joseph Pistone, spent 6 years working his way up the ranks of the most elite mafia families of his time. Joseph was just a teacher, and somehow he managed to fit into a single lifetime the roles of educator, army man, FBI agent, high-ranking mobster, and the stuff that legends and movies are made of. How did he manage to do all that before turning 40? Here's the truth about Donnie Brasco, the jeweler that conned the capos. Joseph Pistone was born in the 1930s and spent his early years growing up on the streets of New Jersey. Joseph's life was looking like it was going to be relatively boring, and quite frankly, he never planned on being any kind of hero. The streets of Jersey were filled with gangsters, both high and low-level ones, and even though little Joey grew up with crime all around him, he didn't quite fit the mold that the rest did. As a reasonably good student, he didn't get into trouble with the law or get sucked into juvenile gangs as a teenager. Normally, the smart kids are swallowed whole by the rough streets, but Joey had just enough street smarts in him to get by without drawing attention to himself. His Calabrian and Sicilian heritage gave him the ability to understand the mob family culture, talk the talk, and blend in with any demographic within those communities. Joseph's unique background is exactly why his life took the route it did. He graduated high school, went to college, and taught high school. He even got married and had 3 little ones running around his mundane and blissfully happy home. Joseph's wife knew that he'd always wanted to join law enforcement, and she encouraged him to pursue his dreams, and Joseph did exactly that. The quickest way to get into law enforcement was through the military, so Joseph signed on to join the Navy. But he did so well at the initial testing phase that he was directly transferred to Naval Intelligence. In 1969, the FBI got wind of the promising recruit and poached him from service. In the Navy, he became licensed to drive almost every heavy truck that's allowed on public roads. This nifty skill got him thrown into a sting operation right from the get-go. The FBI was trying to get into a truck hijacking operation that was being spearheaded by crooks in New York, and since they had a shortage of men who were capable of actually driving trucks, the new recruit, who'd never had been considered for such a dangerous job under normal circumstances, was pulled in as a last resort. And this is where Joseph's journey from rookie to legend began.
Gilly Greco ran a crew that were hijackers and just general thieves.
Purely by accident and the fact that he had a relatively unusual skill that just so happened to be necessary for the task at hand. Joseph rose to the occasion with a hunger and dedication that blew everyone back at headquarters out of the water. Joseph's ability to talk like a man who knew the streets, that Jersey brawl that made him sound like a real mobster, made Joseph look like the real deal. Donnie Brasco was his name now, Brasco, the low-level crook who jacked trucks and moved underground, pushing stolen art and jewelry in the shadows. For 5 years, Pistone racked up dozens of arrests, and since he sold his new identity as a middleman between thieves and sellers, he managed to stay under the radar.
With these individuals, you can't just go up and say, hey, let's shake hands, because that's a sign of weakness.
Sure, he became known as the guy who knew a guy. Donnie Brasco was the middleman for everyone to push their stolen goods through. But he was just enough of a small-timer, and his stings involved the gangs of New York and Florida, that the mob weren't aware of the small fry. So in those first 5 years, he didn't even come into contact with any Italian mobsters, meaning that he would use his fake name and his street cred that came with it to transition into the world of the mafia without being recognized. New York was dealing with the resurgence of the powerful Sicilian families in the 1970s. After the Second World War, the FBI had prosecuted a handful of bosses, and the rest were killed off by those who wanted to take the newly vacated throne, so the mafia had slipped into the background for a decade or two, keeping themselves busy by killing off the last mobsters that were left of a seemingly crumbling empire. The cops left them to their own devices for a while. But by the time the 1970s came around, most of the families had reorganized and were starting to pick up steam again. And this time they were getting a little too cozy with the Colombian drug lords that were starting to make waves on the scene. Business was booming again, and the FBI needed to get a lid on it fast before the families got their feet under them again. So they called the jewel and car thief Donnie Brasco, or as they knew him, Agent Pistone. For 4 months, Pistone studied gems and the jewelry trade, while everything was being put in place for him to enter the field. By the end of his briefing, he knew so much that his knowledge base was equitable with people who had been in the industry for decades. He already knew how to steal and push the jewels, so that skill was already in place. But now he could identify jewels and accurately place value on every piece that was put in front of him. Leaving his wife and kids on the other side of the country, Pistone became Donnie Brasco. All of his files and information were scrubbed by the FBI. His co-workers were just told that he'd been transferred, and every record of his previous arrests was buried. For the next 6 years, Joseph Pistone didn't exist on record to his family or to the world. He targeted the bars and restaurants that he knew some of the mob upperheads liked to frequent. Within 4 months, he found his weakest link: a bartender who liked to push thieves' stolen goods. Brasco starts dealing with him, and he introduces our undercover agent, Don the Jeweler, to some pretty notable figures in the mob. And when you start making money, the big guns start to take notice. Brasco is getting exactly what he wanted: enough street cred and plenty of sparkly sales to draw attention to himself, because the mafia sure likes people who can make them more money. Brasco manages to keep a steady supply of diamonds and gems coming, supplied by the FBI's evidence facilities. But he's getting too good at pushing stolen watches, and his lack of ties is now starting to raise suspicions. Patsy Palmero called for Don the Jeweler, the nickname that the clientele of the mob bars started calling Brasco. Pasqualino Lolordo, or Patsy as everyone called him, was the head of the Chicago chapter, and even to this day he's considered one of the most powerful bosses to ever take charge of a Sicilian house. He was tight with Al Capone, and Brasco couldn't afford to be targeted by a boss of this caliber. Patsy, Jilly Greca, and a lower-level wannabe called Frankie started interrogating Brasco. They want the names of his previous associates as proof that Don the Jeweler is actually who he says he is and is not some narc. But Brasco keeps his cool, even with a loaded gun on the table in front of him. He uses Patsy's recent incarceration as a reason for not giving up any names that Brasco used to work with. Every Italian gangster knows that a man in jail is easily persuadable by the cops, so he plays the game like Patsy could have become an informant while he was behind bars. This is a ballsy move. Patsy attacks Brasco with his fists. Now Brasco can't raise his hands at a boss. That's a death sentence. So he takes his anger out on the only other person in the room who hasn't been officially sworn into a mob house. And that unlucky bastard is Frankie, just a lower-level slimeball who wanted to keep company with the big shots for some clout. The violent outburst works. Poor Frankie is nearly beaten to death before Jilly breaks up the fight and tells Brasco that he now has the Mafia's blessing to do business with him. Brasco played it out like he wasn't a snitch, and that he was deeply offended that anyone would expect him to rat any of his associates out, let alone be a cop. In other words, Brasco's new friends were made just by a complete fabrication, no proof, and a whole lot of balls. Soon, Brasco was delivering jewels for Patsy and the Colombo family. From there, he moved on to Tony Mira of the Bonanno family. To put it into perspective just how much Brasco managed to accomplish in just 6 months, Colombo and Bonanno were two of the names linked to the 5 main factions of families that ran the Mafia. Lucchesi, Genovese, and Gambino made up the other 3. Brasco's dealing gets him into contact with their soldiers and capos on occasion too. The problem was that Brasco was only supposed to be in the field for 6 months. That was the original plan. But now he was selling diamonds supplied by the FBI's evidence lockers and going to all-night craps games with his best buddy Tony Mira, the renowned soldier for the Bonannos, and a complete psychopath. He really likes killing, and he's easily offended. Even the soldiers are scared of Mira. Brasco knew that if he hung around Mira for long enough, he'd end up dead. It didn't matter how well he played the game, Mira was just too unpredictable and dangerous to affiliate with. But for now, he was stuck with Mira's crazy thumb, so he kept an eye out for someone else with more power who could like him enough to take the jeweler under his wing. The craps game and the people Brasco was rubbing shoulders with opened up a whole new world for the FBI. These families were completely connected to each other. Their business deals were intrinsically linked, and they weren't nearly as fractured as they once thought. The blood on the streets was all because of people in the mob's personal tiffs and small fry fights. The ones truly calling the shots were in fact keeping it all under control, and they were making more money than ever. The upper level of the iceberg was just as united as they were under Lucky Luciano's rule in the 30s, before the war. It took them 2 whole decades, but the Sicilians were once again united. Brasco was right in the thick of things, deeper than any agent had ever gotten before, so he stayed a little while longer. And even if his superiors hadn't requested it of him, Brasco wasn't going anywhere anyway. He wanted to see this thing through, and he knew that if anyone could do it, it had to be him. When Mira gets arrested for dealing narcotics, a man by the name of Lefty Rogero lays claim on Brasco. This is a huge deal for a soldier of Lefty's caliber. To lay claim on a wannabe is almost as good as the initiation in the Bonanno family. It's only a matter of time before they officially declare Donnie the Jeweler Brasco as family. As long as Brasco makes money for Bonannos and manages to keep blood off his hands, he'll be good on both sides. But keeping his hands clean proves to be difficult. Mira and Lefty were both known killers. Keeping on Mira's good side was hard enough until the man was sent to prison, and Lefty isn't much better. At least Lefty isn't driven by insanity. He usually kills for a reason. The thing is, Lefty is more valuable than Mira. For one reason, Lefty has one vice, and that's spilling the tea. Like an old woman at a hairdresser, he taught Brasco everything there is to know between the 5 families. who's got beef with who's being suspected of double-crossing or snitching, and most importantly, who's seated where in the hierarchy. Most of the men he named and the positions they held were complete news for the authorities. Until now, they could only have suspicions about who was sworn in or what rank they had, and a whole lot of people Lefty named weren't even on the FBI's radar at all. Lefty's loose lips gave the FBI an inside look into the boss's tables, and they'd never been privy to before. And with the information now streaming in faster than they could keep track of, any reservations they had about keeping Brasco inside for longer were thrown out the window. His stay was extended indefinitely. His services were now indispensable to both the FBI and the Mafia. Brasco's now dancing with associates, soldiers, and even a capo named Sonny Black Napolitano. Just to clarify, the rankings start like this. At the very bottom, you have the associates, the guys who we sometimes call the wannabes. Above them are the soldiers. Some of them have been sworn into a family, and the rest are close to becoming official. Next up, you get the capos. Those are the guys who keep the associates, soldiers, and prostitutes in line. Second in the rankings lie in the underbosses. They represent the big bosses, and they put down the plans that the capos need to make happen. Finally, obviously sits the boss, the head of the family. Consiglieres also have a role to play. They don't get any say in business, but they act as mediators between families, the kind of guys who act as the middlemen when plans are being made or if there's a dispute that needs smoothing over between factions. Consiglieres don't have any official power, but they've got everybody's ear. Now that Brasco had the trust of the first 3 tiers of the totem pole, he needed to get the Fed's eyes on the top 2 layers of command. So he convinces Sonny Black to get into the gambling scene in Florida, and to operate in the great state of Florida, they need to get permission straight from the boss of the Everglades, Santo Trafficante. And the meeting goes down like butter. Trafficante is game for the collaboration, and Sonny Black gets all the credit and the status that comes from sealing such a lucrative deal. Brasco isn't left out of the praise. It was his idea, after all. But Florida's Sheriff's Department isn't clued in on the FBI setup. So, at the celebratory party that Sonny threw to thank Trafficante for his generosity, the police walked in and they arrested everyone. Since it's really only illegal gambling going on, no one gets more than a slap on the wrist. But it's a disaster for Sonny. He's just embarrassed. Trafficano in his own backyard, and you don't get to live down embarrassing a boss. But Sonny still wants in on the Florida gambling scene, and to do that, he needs to start negotiations all over again. And he needs to find a way to mend fences. They arrive back in New York with every intention of starting the whole thing all over again. But there's another problem. Mira the Madman is out of jail, and he wants Brasco back under his command. By now, the name Don the Jeweler is synonymous with shiny things and the money they bring. Mira is infuriated that Sony pilfered Brasco out from under him when he was put away. Mira accuses Brasco of stealing from the Bonanno family, essentially putting a price on the jeweler's head. With the consigliere and the Bonanno boss present, the case gets taken to the Mafia's version of a courtroom. It took 4 weeks for the dispute to come to an end, but Lefty and Sonny vouched for Brasco to the very end. This proves the level of trust Brasco managed to achieve during his time in the midst of the mob. To have a capo and a sworn-in soldier declare his innocence even when they faced execution themselves is the highest degree of honor among thieves that anyone could have hoped for. Now Sonny had his man back, and Mira was put to shame for wasting the boss's time with a dispute driven by jealousy and spite. The boss's time was money, and Mira paid for costing them an audience for nothing. His position as capo is put into question, sort of like probation. But Sonny doesn't just vouch for Brasco, he puts him up for consideration to be sworn into the Bonanno family officially. Sonny considers the jeweler his colleague, friend, and confidant. Brasco had to remind himself on more than one occasion of what the task at hand was. During their long conversations around Sonny's kitchen table, it was easy to forget that he was a cold-blooded killer. Sonny was funny and likable, and he had a soft spot for pigeons. Sonny seemed human. But being sworn in wasn't just a decision based on a capo's good word. Brasco would have to prove his loyalty with blood, and that blood belonged to Bruno Indelicato, a capo who peeved off one too many Bonannos. Actually, he had enemies in just about every Sicilian family in America by that time, so it was just a matter of time before he swam with the fishes anyway. But now, Brasco had a problem. He'd managed to keep his hands clean up until now. The FBI could overlook a robbery or two, maybe even smuggling, but they couldn't clear Brasco for murder, and the last thing Brasco wanted to do was to kill a man. Not going through with the hit meant throwing away the 6 years that Joseph Pistone spent away from his family. 6 years of not seeing his kids grow up, and 6 years just to miss out on becoming the first ever FBI agent to get in so deep that he could practically taste the induction into one of the most powerful mafia families in the world. All for saving the life of a man who was a killer who had a bounty on his head anyway. But it was just too much. The FBI decided that the operation was now too dangerous, so they pulled the plug before Brasco could even attempt to use his gift of gab to talk his way out of killing Indelicato. Not that Brasco didn't try to convince them otherwise. Brasco had the genius and highly dangerous plan to hide Indelicato and put a John Doe in his place to make it look like Brasco had killed him. But the feds weren't having any of it. They knew that Brasco had been under too long. The fact that he managed to stay alive until now was a miracle in itself, and the wiser choice was to quit while they were still ahead. Besides, by now they had enough to arrest every person that Brasco had come into contact with, and he'd given them enough to write the whole rule book on the Sicilian families and how they operated. Brasco walked out in 1981, and he goes by the name Joseph Pistone again for the first time in 6 years. But the FBI doesn't just go in and arrest the baddies left, right, and center. No, they go see Sonny first, slamming the evidence down in front of him. His best friend, his brother Brasco, is an undercover agent, and he, Sonny, was going to pay the ultimate price for letting a Fed get so deep into the mob for all of those years. If Sonny didn't work with them and become an informant so that they could get their hands on the bosses, the Mafia were going to take care of him. They allowed Sonny to take a few days to get over the shock of the betrayal and to decide what he was going to do. Sonny spent some time with his beloved pigeons on the roof of his New York apartment. In the end, Sonny took the way of the mob. He took his disappointment on the run. He disappeared before the FBI could arrest him. Before he disappeared, he gave his most valuable jewelry to his favorite barman, as well as the keys to his apartment, asking the man to take care of his pigeons. Then he got into his car and 2 soldiers drove Sonny Black to his death. Sonny chose the Mafia and the certain death that came with it before turning snitch against his people. This is one death that Pistone regretted his entire life. Sonny was the one guy that he truly came to love and respect in those 6 years. Mira ran too, and he managed to stay alive for a while, but he too was one of the reasons that Brasco got so cozy with the mob, so it wasn't long before he got taken out too. Lefty got lucky. The cops knew that there was probably a hit on him by now, so they arrested him so he could at least be safer behind bars than out on the streets and at the mercy of the capos and their soldiers. Lefty's words in court when he heard the evidence that Brasco collected were, "I get that MF'er Donnie if it's the last thing I do." New York's leading mafia families kicked the entire Bonanno family off the commission for the grievous sin they'd committed. But Donnie Brasco was the man in the middle of it all. Do you really think the mob was going to let him go that easy? Not only was there a hit, put out on him, but that hit had a sweet reward attached to it. $500,000 for Brasco's head. So the FBI paid a visit to every boss in the commission, advising them that killing Joseph Pistone would start a war the likes of which the mob had never seen before. The full wrath of the FBI would come down on them, and the bosses weren't willing to gamble with that kind of threat. They pulled back the hit, and Pistone could finally testify in court after spending 2 years in hiding. Pistone's work led to over 200 indictments and more than 100 convictions. He is undoubtedly the only man on this planet who got to call the men of the mob friends and managed to pull the wool over their eyes. He is one of the most decorated men in the history of the FBI and inside the Mafia. But to them, Pistone is the boogeyman under the bed. He is the embodiment of the shadows that can infiltrate their ranks, the reason they kill so indiscriminately amongst each other. For the slightest infractions, Pistone is why the biggest sin you can commit is to turn snitch. After that operation, he could never go undercover again, not with the infamy attached to his name and his face, so he kept busy in other ways. Pistone wrote 7 books, most of them about his time in the Bonanno family's court. One of those books became the blueprint for the iconic movie Donnie Brasco, starring Al Pacino as Lefty and Johnny Depp as the main man, Donnie Brasco. He acted as an advisor on the film and many other movies that played out around the mob. His inside take added the sprinkle of authenticity that directors found invaluable. Then there are the interviews and the crime coverages on the legend too. But then again, Donnie Brasco, or Joseph Pistone, or whatever you want to call him, is truly the stuff that movies are made of.
This is a friend of ours.
He actually lived what we see on the screen. And man, did he live.